Hello everyone, today we talk about high medieval communities' power through a lens that simply nobody discusses on YouTube, for obvious reasons. What has always perplexed me in general after several years of mostly medieval history content teaching is that on this platform, as well as practically anywhere else, whenever you search for a site, people still look at sort of pages, whatever, in the first Google results or whatever, about medieval history or society, whatever, there is no trace whatsoever of any deeper awareness in a systemic awareness sense. Like if people think about medieval society, oh look, there's an article on the peasant, or look at an article of the nobleman. It's just this stereotype, kind of sort of incredibly superficial, but especially wrong, false, right, misrepresentation of medieval society and its complexity. That does not come from, okay, there is a trick here, you can switch in a word or another, and magically it's the thing. No, it's literally stemming from the lack of any whatsoever knowledge of medieval historiography as we know it, meaning all what has been thoroughly studied by sort of serious scientific standards in the academies for generations and generations, that has seemingly not filtered at all into any of the broader audience. And the reasons are many. I could make many videos probably in a row discussing this, what kind of psychological roots exist to it, what kind of anthropological limits this situation basically reflects. It's not a major sort of social-cultural collapse. It's not just the shrinking of worth of individuals. It's literally the realization that there is probably a threshold beyond which the wide majority of the world does not actually get into it. It's not much about being niche. It's probably not wanting to know how history actually worked, right? And on Schwerpunkt, I've always dedicated, I still don't know what kind of sort of possible theme this is, whether medieval society, medieval politics, whatever, government, this video can be. But I've always sort of felt the need, especially when talking about societies that had largely sort of important traits in common when you look at sort of Western civilization at this point, as well as others, right, and neighboring them. But this is a problem I noticed, in fact, an absence existing in a deeper sense when we, for example, made those comparisons between the West and Byzantine Empire. Probably the knowledge of how much and how far and how more we know about the West in general and how it functioned practically. If you want to understand anything about Middle Ages, you don't even have to sort of open 20 books, studying them all, you could simply listen even to a video like mine. It's simply having a grasp of it. It's that easy because, again, because of the minimum that the average person sticks to, an idea of the scale of the issue and of the depth of knowledge that we possess in general about these topics that can even be sort of minimally more than what you normally believe. And these topics are very interesting because they tell, if anything, and this is what people don't understand. You just click on what sounds either national or ethnic, or ideological or religious, because this is a product of fatherlessness. Let's be honest. Like, we are producing large swathes of the population, but at this point that have been normally raised without fathers in the home, and simply do not have any point of reference whatsoever. Because, of course, nor the family who can speak, or school or university or any kind of society gives them any glimpse of what an actual education, an actual authority is, right? This is what I always say about history. History goes by authority. There isn't really a mechanical process where you learn history just by citing other people or sort of trying to sort of simply sound formally coherent, where you must first of all form in a higher sort of ghostly sense, and then you have to provide with lots of substance. That is also even the more menial aspect sort of the historical research, but it's also the one without which you can't really do anything to begin with. And that normally happens, in fact, when you're young and dumb, but also incredibly receptive and empty enough to, in fact, have lots of room for treasuring new knowledge, right? This concept is completely skipped on a regular basis. And as I was saying, the most important trait actually of these discussions is that they actually teach you where power lay, and not figuratively, not metaphorically, not by the arbitrium or the sort of opinion of somebody. Let's stop pretending and people's opinions are relevant in any case. Here we're talking about what we actually know in the factual mechanism of medieval politics and society. If you're interested in military history and you want to pretend to know warfare, there's no way you can know anything if you don't know medieval politics and in detail at that point, if you want to know military history in detail as well, right? This is a Clausewitzian paradigm. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's on you. I've done enough here to make myself clear on the channel. But this is exactly the point. History does not work through some sort of, supermarket citation. I will pick this when it's useful. I don't need to create a system, a basis, a sort of broader vision or concept of that. Wrong. You should always pursue the building, the construction, direction of a massive system that allows you to accurately and objectively, that is beyond any subjectivity, beyond any individuality, understand how historical reality worked, right? You have to be able to explain in any given system how politics worked, how war worked, how society worked. If you're not capable of doing so, if you are, I'm sort of trying to guess in general about the world, or trying to make up some structuralistic fantasies because you're not able to understand how fluid and dynamic reality on a regular basis is, while there are some foundational principles to the same as well, you will never have a good historical understanding, right? Or an understanding to begin with, right? Today we talk about essentially peasant autonomy and also peasant communes. We will talk essentially throughout mostly like the high medieval period, throughout the entirety of it, not just the later communes, especially in central northern Italy, that we will discuss now, because at least most of the documentation and also the forms of peasant organization in a very developed society all around are sort of higher, right? We understand much better what was happening there, and we see that per capita people were richer, also the peasantry, and it was more connected with the cities and so on. And in some forms of statal government, tendentially statal, because the High Middle Ages were not there yet. It's basically, you have to wait. We'll get actually to the thresholds of the 13th century where that statal form starts affirming fully. But this is also for those who think that studying, I don't know, the history of quote-unquote minor powers is not actually studying the history of big powers, as they actually were at the time. And how this informed the whole system, because peasants were still the majority of the population, right? For example, like this example, Italian communes in particular, at least you would have sort of half people living in the city, half in the countryside, at the peak probably of medieval urbanism civilization. This is another story. In any case, the peasantry was majoritary. And I like to make this video also to address, you see, if I talk peasants, people think, oh my god, it's more like a social, but sort of socialistically leaning topic, or why should we learn about the fourth estate? Again, you can make a perfectly valid history lesson without changing any of your political views, on the contrary, reinforcing them on the basis of evidence, because mostly people who attach themselves to this kind of topics like rural communities or peasant communes and so on don't do it, in fact, for the sake of explaining what this mechanism really was. Mostly nobody really arrives to define these concepts. And social history is mostly approach to classism, at least as a footprint in pop culture nowadays. Here we make actual history, not what lesser people think. All right. Now, there's a question that arose at some point in certain historiography, that is whether, and we will see all this better also documented in another video, the formal written charters that define the reciprocal rights of lords and peasants, so the relation between one another, represented for the lesser military nobility, often referred to as the minor aristocracy tied to local seigneurial holdings, a diminution of their local political authority, or instead a decline in their economic revenues. In other words, already trying to split things between politics and economy is not really a good question. And in fact, these questions were mostly asked, I don't know, in the 1960s, the 1970s, 80s even, when there was a pretty heavily structuralistic, materialistic, and Marxistically influenced, at least, historiography. The answer is no, right? We have a pretty good idea of the fact that, first of all, some of the, as we'll see better, especially in this video, that while the minor aristocracy, especially the rural one, the one that emerges, as we've seen also recently in the video about Arduin of Ivrea, in the sort of the post-Carolingian era, etc., that occurs because of the expansion of the communes, of the foundation of the communes in particular. And so the development of cities further that had always been the center, especially in a region like the Italian kingdom, does not actually bring to an end to a level of social certification. If anything, it increases it, right? Because the commune is consularly founded, meaning that the consular regime that founds the commune, not as a city, but as a city government, fundamentally derives from this aristocracy of different degrees, not just the minor one, but minor one is the numerical backbone, right, of the higher one. We will be coming back this video periodically on the Kingdom of Italy as an example, because again, we get most of the evidence from here. But in that aforementioned video about Arduin of Ivrea, you have seen how that Italic ruler was essentially trying to remunerate those minor militas, right, those sub-vassals, also in what was still pretty explicitly the imperial hierarchy, with some communal posts at the detriment of the bishops' counts of the Ottonian era. And the reason why that was being done is that, of course, the bishop counts were holding sway on cities. That's what fundamentally mostly controlled the cities before the communes. I made a specific video explaining who ruled in the city before that, the foundation of the consular regime. And in that case, if anything, because the local Italic ruler, as we've seen, Arduin was the last medieval native Italic king to rule, and the reason being that essentially the feudal nobility in Italy will gradually dissipate in favor of urbanization of that is mirrored by the same militas founding the commune, right, and maintaining this regime up until the 13th century, for over a century, never really abandoning it, like being always part of it, even though at some point the popolo arose, the seigneurial of popolo, etc. Those are things that we mostly see for the 13th and 14th century. It's a very different story. And that did so because of not just the sort of habitual eclipses of German imperial authority that left the Italian kingdom de facto to be ruled by the communes, but in that sense, also the sort of the passage from, in fact, a rural aristocracy tradition in post-Carolingian times to a urbanized one that would defend its own prerogatives, not from the basis of a kingdom, but from the basis of individual cities that will also successfully, in fact, repel in later times, like through the Lombard League, for example, the position of a more direct Germanic rule, and so on. This is incredibly interesting because when you would say, what does this have to do with peasants? Well, it has a lot to do with that, as you understand. Even if I don't explain it to you, you can't get there. You stop the video right now and try to think of an answer, then restart it and see whether it was my own as well. And I'm cheating because I know the answer. But I started, so I'm not cheating. The point is fundamental because when we look at, seriously, the development of rural communes, and so peasant communes, so we can call them different ways. Rural is better because at that point the identity was not merely a matter of peasantry, as a matter of fact. As we'll see better now, because there were, for example, third estators that greatly contributed to that. The latter, in fact, were normally tied to city markets. And the city, in any case, had a big army, controlled the district, and generally speaking, ruled still these rural communes. In fact, since we make a lot of videos about communal Italy, when you look at that map of 30, at some point, probably city-states fighting against one another, sort of commune more, commune less, you don't have to think that the commune as a concept is fundamentally just applicable to that sort of local district, episcopate, on which sort of the city built since antiquity on the city itself. The concept of commune extends as a broader form of guild or corporation, however you want to call it, universitas, as a matter of fact, which was also the name that at least gave the name itself to our concept of university, but that was really the concept for any kind of association, commune included, all right, guilds, etc., because it means, as you know, turn towards a single purpose. Right. Hence, also the universe that is, as we've seen with in the European theology, expressing the same concept. Hardly an idea of acephaly or anarchy or chaos. Like I still have people who sort of want to comment on my content, even in sort of peaceful and friendly manner, but that still sort of hold. I don't know after how long. Watching my content, still expressing these ideas of a sort of chaotic, disordered, dark, inefficient Middle Ages. Here we're talking about high medieval Europe. We're talking about yes, as well, yes, but we're talking about that topic. One of the most radically, overly advancing, rampant, and effervescent civilizations in the entire history of mankind. Right? If you don't know this by scale, you cannot afford to understand literally any topic. It's not like, I don't know, you just study the Americas in the 19th century that you can't do without this stuff. You don't know this stuff, you don't know anything about the entire history of the world. All right, it's zero. It's at that point, throw away books or at least do something about it, because it's completely useless for any person who can inspire to any civic right and or at least any worth of the same to go about it without knowing any of this, right? Cancel it from your mind. You're not a Westerner. You're not a European if you don't know these things, all right? You should be deported together with illegal immigrants. We don't care absolutely about this kind of people. Here we are actual European traditionals, and we don't really care about anyone who does not know about this, right? In any case, the point we're making is crucial because as far as we go with the lesser nobility in particular, the fact that somebody would be able essentially to bring them to a table of negotiations, but also for themselves to accept the draft of a document or many of these agreements were naturally publicly sworn. It was a matter of that point of witnesses, of custom, right? We've seen it in the series about medieval law, is remarkable of essentially a reciprocity, a mutuality, as we were saying before. And this can hardly go, especially in times of civilizational expansion, just in a direction or another, right? So scholars at some point said, but, the fact that the peasants, fundamentally, anybody who's subject to local lords, which is a big thing, because, again, the Middle Ages is not like the knight that is the lord and nobody above him, by the way, and the peasant. There's nothing between the two, and this level of sort of terrible chthonic subjection and superstition. This is not medieval civilization, right? And especially not medieval civilization in the most disproportionately advanced parts of the globe, like in this case. So what we're looking at is necessarily the product of an achievement, an important development. There would be other times of sort of depression, of collapse, for also the entire world, in mostly very transversal ways. But this was definitely not the moment. This was a moment of great expansion. Essentially, today we look at something like from the 10th to the 12th century. That's mostly the arc we cover. Now, those formal written charters that define the reciprocal rights of lords and peasants are known as charters, as documents of charters of rural, quote-unquote, liberties, because of the concept of libertas, that in fact is not one of freedom, that is very different, and it is actually much more traditional than freedom, which is at least just a more metaphysically spatial concept, whereas libertas has to do with the tradition of incarnated divine rule, right, coming from Romanity. And so freedom is a potential space that you had to go through. Liberty is properly a relation that you have with your master that allows, in fact, for your growth, right, in this gradual liberation, literally, in the moment in which you become emancipated, more powerful, right? If you studied Roman law, we're talking about. And of course, the term is very much more specific and legally technical in medieval civilization. But anyway, I would like to stress that, strangely enough, like on X, you start seeing this increased explosion of Nordicism, all this kind of bullshit. And they want to make you believe, also because you're an ignorant if you believe in it to begin with, that basically there was some alleged liberty after the Roman Empire, especially of places in Northern Europe. You know, I made videos on these topics. There is no comparison between the level of liberty of an Italian peasant compared to the one of an English one, right? Actually, English peasantry was pretty heavily brought under by not just the Normans, of course, with properly a regime in position, but also in previous times, like being quote-unquote freer, but being poorer in a more destabilized society. And, you know, it's not liberty. It's even less freedom, of course. And there is no historiographical evidence of any kind of fundamental improvement of those areas compared to, say, to any achievement in absolute terms compared to the ones of Southern Europe up until, and in relative terms only, very late in the Middle Ages, and it took other centuries and many centuries. It still sort of didn't even happen at some point for some fringes of Northern Europe until our very days. So this is because you don't study these things, and everybody can. The important thing about this is that if someone who has met you has studied these things, and you talk about anything of that in those terms, the person immediately understands that you know literally nothing about it, right? And it's way more important and qualitative and high as a form of culture than whatever you have to say, if those are your lines of debate, as a matter of fact. I didn't have any discussion for anyone on this, but I'm just sort of looking at what kind of, again, underschooled kind of level of pseudo-historical delusion nonsense is. I don't even say debate or sort of commentaries happening on X. It's just a form of mental illness and radical alienation from reality, just for ethno-narcissistic reasons, as a matter of fact. Liberties are also known as franchises that actually derive from the Franks. And before somebody says, oh, here, that's the Germans who brought that about. Yeah, because those were one of the most oligarchically organized peoples. And look at how, in fact, peasants lived in northern France in comparison, for example, to the ones of the Italic kingdom at this point. But these terms, by the way, are very transversal. They're used all over Western Europe, just in these more dynamic ones, including, in fact, the places that were by some degree more oligarchic, just like northern France. Again, northern France and northern Italy in terms of social development are basically the top places in Europe at this point. And we'll see this better also happening, in fact, in French history, in their own version. Now, these naturally, the way these rural liberties or franchises were applied in Italy were very different from that in the north. But to answer the aforementioned question, such charters did not abolish the lord's banal rights. I hope that you know what banum is, right? In that sense, it's a seigneurial prerogative to impose taxes and dues on dependent peasants within their own jurisdiction. The banum or banno also in Italian sources, if you're interested in sort of the relative, because in different parts of Europe, it was called in different ways, but fundamentally banal lordship, the bannum is notorious, it was in post-Carolingian Europe was used like, and it derived, in fact, from a originally consensual relation between spontaneously formed at this point, in particular, the post-Carolingian period, as it was forming in post-Carolingian period, say, was already there, say, by the 10th, the 11th century, the 12th that we're arriving to, as a direct command of the lord in exchange of the support of the peasants as well for his military enterprise to defend, for example, the same community. So these were relations that had historically always been dialectical, had always entailed a do des. That's what we said before, that the concept of libertas entails. That's what the sort of the master and the freedman are basically about. Some of these people were actually also freemen on their own. So never think that the community per se is just of people that in block have a lower condition, right? It's just how they, and in particular in these cases, decide to associate themselves, in which form, why, and what kind of protection to seek in order to more efficiently defend the system. This is very interesting because also from a military point of view, and it explains the point that we often make in our videos. There were some countries in Europe that by the time of the 13th to 14th century had, for example, the stronger infantries in Europe. But you don't see infantry victories there over cavalry. Why? Because society was fully integrated. Politically speaking, it did not make any sense to go at war against the knights. Not just because these were powerful, but because literally your identity was based on a broader community that could afford both knight infantry integrated. And most of the infantry victories, for example, that were dispatched to you, fakely sold as a scam, as, oh, look, there's the progress of infantry in the later Middle Ages, are just basically a bunch of desperate communities in the fringe, in a decentralized position of the greater powers that kept fighting with knights and also beating the hell out of even most, actually all of the of these infantries that were rising against them, and especially with the crisis of the mid-14th century. Just yesterday I made a video about the Burgundian state's military history, at least in the later phase that sees something else. But in the previous episode, we had seen how the Flemish get beaten all the way through, right? From between Montpevel to Guinegate, you have almost 2 centuries of complete beating of purely infantry armies at the hands of French knights, all right? And this is the point that we're making. Liberty, it's such a beautiful word as opposed to freedom, because it literally expresses the aforementioned hierarchical relations of existing within an actual civilization, right? An idea of uncharted water that you have to explore, especially if you don't have resources, you're just doing so because otherwise you're starved to death. It's not really a good way to, especially to use the term freedom. Right, it's something very different. We can't try to slam on it just to say, okay, well, that's what I want to think it is. It wasn't. All right, these communities could negotiate with their banal lords, not because they were fundamentally at war with them, but because they were becoming more affluent, together with their lords as well. There were more complex things to harness, right? In terms of social complexity, we know pretty well which sort of how the geographical pattern of social development in Europe. Right? I found people that are trying to suggest that certain countries were more or less important depending on just how quantitatively populated they were, as if there was no, this is what a communist would think, by the way. The point is that in the Middle Ages, there wasn't much difference after all between wealth in populations. Really? Do you want to compare post-Roman Europe in the West, and especially in the Mediterranean, with, say, Central Europe or Eastern Europe? Well, good luck with that. And again, it's not just about post-Roman thing. Also, the Byzantine countryside sucked, as a matter of fact. And they didn't have any of this level of autonomy, for that matter. but never mind, having an actual academic culture, right? It's better to post trash on X, as a matter of fact. What we see instead in all this is that the charters rather limited and regulated banal rights to prevent, if anything, excessive or arbitrary enforcement. It does show, of course, that the local communities were more powerful. Remember the context here, mostly districts. All right, you find this stuff pretty much all over Europe tendentially. All right, tendentially towards the 12th, the 13th century, you have the communes, can be communes, can be peasants, can be other sort of form of association or estates, however they were recognized, that start getting increasingly negotiable power. All right, and it's a prerogative, especially of Western civilization, because there is none of this in the other ones, where the development of massive states does not actually happen, say, to full detriment of local autonomies. All right, at this point, you have monarchies with massive communes within them. You have essentially, even within the communes, the same knightly hierarchy that you find, say, in technically even the same countries where these communes existed, depending on what we're talking. I made a video, for example, about Louis VI and the commune of Soissons. Right, in northeast France, there was a great deal of communal development that the king, for example, fostered in favor of these cities to contain episcopal power. Right, so it was never an alma. It was never saying, okay, well, these lords would have not wanted to have more power tendentially, but they also realized that rather than repressing, it was better to harness those resources, to invest more in them, to allow them more space to grow so that you could and would get further power from the same. Again, peasant revolts are, you can say, something particularly rare in the Middle Ages in absolute terms. There are entire phases in European history that are mostly, in fact, the ones of crisis in which this happens. But this is exactly the point. It's only when the system starts engulfing themselves, there were no security measures, no checks and balancement, whatever, that we get the picture of the knights blasting the peasants, right? Or the communes blasting the salaried workers in the industry, textiles, like in Italy or Flanders, right? You know of the Jacquerie, you know of massive disasters in the entire history of mankind, like the Hussite movement that destroyed Bohemia and basically had it collapse as an autonomous country, or something that could have, in fact, as it had in previous century, a truly central position in European political affairs. And this is, again, a process happening fundamentally through the disintegration of much of what the great medieval civilization had been in the wake of the Black Death and the crisis of the 14th century and so on. And it's at that point, if anything, that things get particularly gloomy, right? But let's not go as far as back as the early Middle Ages, that were still, however, mostly a period of growth. And during the High Middle Ages, you have, in any case, the best example of the fact that sort of peasant revolts were fairly rare, right? They existed mostly in contexts that were already depressed by themselves, that, for example, did not have enough surplus. We've seen the Dithmarschen in the Jutland Peninsula with this Frisian, because there's a bunch of Frisians in the Jutland, for that matter, that resisted the Counts of Holstein and so on. It actually beat them more often than not, but sometimes they managed to pull off some kind of victory against their knights in those labyrinthic marshes on the North Sea. Why? Because the Counts of Holstein were definitely not among the richest aristocrats in Europe. In Northern Europe, there was less surplus, and therefore also societal structures were more primitive and less developed to begin with. But if you look at France, if you look at Italy, etc., there were occasionally peasant revolts, some movements. Think about, even ideologically speaking, the heretics, the Cathars in Occitania and so on. You had important agitations, unrest, whatever, but overall, you don't find any sort of classist struggle. That's mostly something that, especially, people got a bit too much obsessed in classistic terms that do not exist, not just because any ism is dumb, but because mostly in history, unfortunately, we had this structuralistic, Marxistically influenced notion that everything is economical. And that for anyone who has a minimal historical literacy knows that does not exist, right, in the world of reality. The problem here is properly understanding that, in fact, civilization mostly developed in an integrated way, politically and socially, right? And if something is sort of rolling backward, it's mostly momentarily a cause of crisis and or some particular struggle that normally does never take the character of simply a class versus another, right? If you know anything about, I don't know, Italian, Flemish history in particular, those are very well documented. In the mid-14th century, we also made lots of videos. It's all transversal, right? You hardly have any sort of estate versus estate mechanism, just per se, right? And it depends on the quantities, because if you look at the jacquerie, it's obvious that in France, most people were peasants. There was greater pressure in that regard, greater imbalance, and so things would start from there. But then not even there, like peasants understood, for example, they were actual peasants, or that they had a huge potential of control, whatever. There were some, there were the third estates, the merchants of Paris that wanted to actually fuel that because they thought they could liberate themselves from the monarchy, or from, in any case, what they perceived as oppressive nobility. They would have had the entire system collapse, rather, in order to make in the moment a few money that, in any case, a more decadent Paris would have not really obtained on the longer run. So it's always more or less the same story, like lesser people trying to undermine civilization that get routinely sort of eradicated, as a matter of fact, with the further affirmation of the elite and the further sinking of lesser people, like in all moments of crisis and revolution. When we look at, instead of this positive picture of the aforementioned charters, in many documented cases, the peasant communities had to pay substantial sums either as an immediate lump payment or through installment commitments over extended periods to obtain these charters from the lords in the first place. So a charter that was regulating banal lordship was normally issued, was sort of consensually signed by the same lords, evidently not to actually get much less power. On the contrary, it's as if the peasants had to pay him a big deal in the moment to get some of these autonomies, and still at the end of the day for these communities to develop still under that banal lordship. This happened throughout different centuries, as we will see now, right? But we'll make more specific examples. Now, the other question is, what specific advantages then did village inhabitants, primarily the peasants, derive from such agreements? Because that's obvious too, like these peasants weren't paying that much just for nothing. Well, primarily for those peasants who remained in condition of unfreedom, still bound as dependents or serfs to the lord, the charters achieved the abolition of levies that served as explicit symbols of servitude. The staticum, this was a poll tax levied per individual precisely due to their dependent status. So this is, remember, it's also some of the lowest form of banal subjection, right? And things will gradually improve over the centuries for everybody involved, at least up to the crisis of the mid-14th century. You have the folk mariage. This was a notoriously a fee exacted by the lord when a dependent peasant married outside the original seigneurial, that is the lord's jurisdictional territory. Because, why, by the way? Because not just there was a due to the transaction to be paid at, but it was a matter of dowry, right? You couldn't marry with anyone that lived, for example, in another seigneurial, and so you would bring wealth outside of the lord's control. That was basically the reason why this happened. Then you had the so-called dead hand, the legal restriction preventing free inheritance, whereby the lord could claim the deceased tenant's entire property or a significant portion upon death, right? And this happens in a moment just in places where, of course, again, peasants were weaker, sort of negotially, and lords were stronger accordingly. And in general, for example, the dead hand was mostly an obvious necessity to the extent that the banner lord was actually the real rule, the real authority in any given place, right? So if you're more exposed to sort of enemy invasions, there's a greater stability, there are some particular military needs, there is a condition as almost a martial law, right, mentality by default that renders such acquisitions justified. Again, I will not explain how banner lordship formed because I made a lot of videos, especially in the early days of Schwerpunkt, explaining how it is and how it originated. But I can't stress enough how these local communities historically had actual freedom in some cases. Not all of them, but this largely changes also across the years. At some point, they could have lost evidently much of that. The fact there were some people who were historically free and de facto turning to serfs and others, and vice versa. We've seen it well in the video about the ministeriales, but this, again, is not just a German thing for that matter. It's just like the apex of it. And in any case, still, that's a very elite society to begin with, so it was not like a world upside down evidently. But there are also situations where, in fact, peasants, like through these charters, increase their own autonomy. They get their own status recognized, also because they had their own actual local assemblies. They had their way to exercise justice. And the Lord would just sort of like had a policeman behind every hut trying to see what was going on and wanted to check. He didn't care. Like, he was just sort of appealed to when a particularly serious situation was, for example, engulfing society, did not know how to solve it. Normally, all these issues regulate matters of land exploitation. I mean, what medieval charters are fundamentally or largely about, all sort of major juridical cases, etc., revolve around who owned which land and on the basis of which sort of contract, condition, etc. Right, and it's very interesting to see how they carried out inquiries, what level of literacy. And I must say, as a medievalist, studying those sources, I can't say it's funny per se, and again, I'm not a historian of society, but it really, like, if you want to really see what society was at the time, so basically everything else, you can't but pass through some examples, some specific historical, some scholarly works. Now, these charters we are discussing today also eliminated the arbitrary and unpredictable character of seigneurial exactions, which had historically constituted an issue. It was not much the fact that the Lord had arbitrarily imposed things without any logic. On the contrary, it had always been done una tantum. It's like, I don't know, think about even the Roman army donativum. Nobody ever received a fixed salary, or from the other side provided a fixed canon. The same goes for peasants, right? Even though they had the lower hand in this, but historically the arbitrary exaction was mostly a way to negotiate the frequency in a more or less predictable way so that society could organize itself accordingly. And still, this was recognized as long as the banal lordships existed, exactly because those resources were used to defend, to protect, to judicate the same community, so to be run, to be exercised. Otherwise, there would have not been a seigneury to begin with. This allowed, for example, the talia, general tax or imposition, to be apportioned proportionally based on the actual economic capacity of the heads of peasant households. In other words, they were creating their own little state, right? They were saying, but we should do things in a bit more of a practical fashion, because again, back at the age of the second invasions, the community would have paid how much was due to the Lord for him to organize some professional military defense, whatever. By the 12th century, say, the problem was, we are better off right now. Like, we are richer, we have more property, whatever. Why should we arbitrarily pay? Who does decide? Like, let's set the rules and let's simply organize ourselves better. This is an index of social development, of greater wealth, and general of greater civilization, all of this. So this is not much a problem of conflict or antagonism between the lord and the peasant. This was a traditionally integrated society where things started scaling up in terms of actual administration, allocation of resources, expenditures, and so on. Now, in numerous instances, although not universally, the peasants succeeded in removing the lord's appointed officials and agents who had enforced seigneurial demands locally as well. You understand why this happened. If the community could administrate itself by itself, they had their own local leaders and people deputed to this mechanism, why should they have answered to a middleman sent by the Lord? Of course, that was a mean of control from the side of the Lord. So there is definitely a competition. There is definitely a level of conflictuality, but it is also a matter of, can this society organize itself by itself? I'm still the lord of it. As we've seen before, they paid for this. They wanted themselves, they had enough surplus themselves to pay the lord in a satisfactory fashion for him to concede these rights. Right? Every situation is different, so you can't generalize. But again, it's a much more harmonious mechanism than one would normally or ideally or stereotypically think. Villagers preserved, and in certain cases even expanded, their collective rights to exploit common lands and resources such as pastures, woods, and waters shared by the community. Historically, these resources had been mostly exploited by the lord as a broader prerogative. The more the community expanded, it's not much that they had, maybe in absolute terms, even more relative power in the world, but they had on these local resources. Again, if the lord had stepped up and he was even ruling from the city and he wanted to have more competitive countryside, he would subcontract these territories with the peasants and or would simply grant them this right of exploitation, because again, there's basically a different thing from owning them, as you know. This would be carried out through different means. Like some lords would also have, especially in the more feudal parts of Europe, like a greater delegation for specific functionaries. But if the community again had satisfactorily expanded by itself, why wouldn't you let them operate them? Because historically it had already kind of happened. They would pay for it, you would maintain control on them, let it happen. The villagers further secured various forms of local self-administration, including the right to appoint rural guards, interestingly enough, chosen from within the community to maintain order, which in multiple ways restricted the lord's direct exercise of judicial authority over the villagers as well. Imagine, again, like all the cost of a seigneurial administration, right? Here we're mostly speaking of a situation where the lord leveled up in terms of personal power, the one of his seigneury. That, as you know, could be also a very complex thing. There were some seigneuries that stretch over hundreds of kilometers or at least not contiguously. I mean, and so, who really had even the time of the resources to micromanage everything. It didn't make any sense, right? Especially in the most monetized, commercial sort of trade, prosperous, monetized areas, there would be a greater sort of purchasing character of these liberties and the relative seigneuries as well. At some point, we know of people who erected castles to simply, because they had resources, to simply sell them to lords. Like, that's the level of sort of wealth of certain areas and the fluidity of the seigneurial establishment. This gets ever more complex with the centuries, because even when you see sort of more robust seigneuries, principalities, etc., they mostly stem from this initial forms of control. For example, here we observed some sort of local rural guards, right? Historically, police, this kind of enforcers, had been used by the same lords, right? There were, like, in particularly sort of poor moments in history, like in the very early Middle Ages, in the depths, etc., between the sort of in the beginning of the 10th century, like this kind of very dark eras, if anything, because we also have society was much simpler, but we also have less documentation. But we know that even royal functionaries patrolling, like mostly the fordings, controlled mountain passes, etc., were relatively simple people. They weren't, and you understand they were co-opted already at that point from the local communities, because how do you even simply control a passage, right? What kind of authority do you have to stop people, right? To arrest fugitives, right? Or enemies, spies, etc. This is something we will never fully understand because we don't have enough evidence, but sort of for the later centuries, things become really clear for the relative societies, and we can't sort of grasp also how complex the situation would have been before. Now, going back definitely to Italy, that has this incredibly interesting documentation regarding it. In the central and northern regions, that had historically been the most dynamic, right, by this point, since essentially the Lombard kingdom, encompassing areas such as Tuscany, Lombardy, Emilia, Piedmont, and Liguria. Opposition to seigneurial dominance emerged prominently from as early as the 11th and 12th centuries. Right, the examples that we made before are valid also for the late Middle Ages. Right, there are lots of peasants that historically, even at some point through the same crisis of the 14th century, most peasants had it worse. In relative terms, the ancien regime affirmed itself over the lower strata of the population, but in very, again, fringe areas, you have the rise of some local communes. We've seen it well, for example, in the video about the Swiss-Habsburg Wars, right? The Swiss didn't really have too much, right, that sort of would qualify them as particularly developed in the moment or with many resources. They had control on some alpine passes, and this also brought them some wealth, and that's also the reason why the Habsburgs went fighting against them. But in a broader sense, what also happened is that the seigneurial power had shrunk, right? The age of the great universal seigneuries, etc. The Habsburgs had an enormous power at the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century. With the crisis of the 14th century, this power shrinks, and there's a vacuum that the Landfried are issued to gap, and this is carried out by the local communes. What is interesting is that there's always a local commune of some sort, right? Peasants are always organized in some form of society. So this was what had historically existed before, but there is a collapse, if anything, mostly from a territorial point of view. Again, elites actually increase their power, but not in a more direct sense. Also, the earlier 13th, early 14th century universal achievements had not really been possible because there was this dramatically thicker sort of administration or bureaucracy. In part, it had happened, but even that had mostly floated over general well-being and previous autonomies and local forms of local self-government, basically, in the wake, by the way, of traditional common law, which historically was just how every common law had emerged, including the Roman one, that eventually became civil law, became more stringent, more subtle, because, again, you can't have otherwise a proper state later. And so this is very interesting, aside from the fact that Roman law also was further reapplied in the later Middle Ages all across Europe as a form of common law itself, right? But I made lots of videos on the topic and why that happens. There is definitely in the later Middle Ages a greater need of state control, right? Because when, as we said before, seigneuries shrink, who does help people? Not everybody's the Swiss, right? That also will sort of very gradually and ultimately just isolate from the system in order to also much later flourish the way they did. So we must always contextualize this and how it happened, right? I made a video here since we mentioned Italy, because I made one about the Longobards, Longobard society. And these videos are very interesting in and of themselves, but as I said at the beginning, they don't seem to get so much. There is a video that I made in 2021. It is the assimilation of servile and free Massari and the evolution of the concept of servus, which is actually, I think, one of those videos that I have to re-upload. Yeah, because they don't have the pictures. Okay, well. This one instead is neatly ad hoc for the previous period, especially if you're interested in Italy from 2022. The Longobard nobility and the passage from colony to Massarian were as early as the 8th century. And it shows you how already, with the well-being of the 8th century, the recovery from the so-called Dark Ages, there was, especially in those areas that, as you see, are also the same of the 11th and 12th century we mentioned before, of the Italic kingdom, former Longobard one, you have an actual increase in the individual liberty of the peasantry, right, compared to the immediately previous period, right? So Italy is incredibly precocious for a number of reasons that are sort of macroscopically self-evident in the waves of sort of civilizational, sort of the time zones of civilizational development in chronological order. This was true, for example, the earliest encastellation had started from actually the region around Rome. And you find in parallel also, as I was saying before, not much an oppression of local society, but actually a further integration of ever greater power. It doesn't happen everywhere in the same way. Again, I don't know, the Normans in southern Italy went pretty heavily handed and they concentrated a great deal of power, more like along the French model. This is true also for, as we said before, for Norman England, where the peasantry had some very limited autonomy, as a matter of fact, by Western standards. But again, to each their own. Now, this resistance, some scholars call it like this, of the peasants, sticking to Italy here in northern central Italy between the 11th and 12th centuries. That is also the century, probably the moment in which communes appear. Exactly the late 11th, the early 12th century. That's where consular regimes are affirmed, including over the district, because it is true that most of those peasants were under other rural lords that remained as the historical feudal nobility in the countryside. So that's, in any case, mirroring communal establishment, because part of these people were also urbanized. In any case, they had to compete with the commune if they had remained severed from it and or were antagonistic towards it. So everything is ramping up in terms of organization, including from a military point of view. Like peasant militias, where they are quite useful. And in any case, the resistance of the peasant communes to the lordly authority compelled holders of the bannum either to relinquish certain tributes and compulsory personal services, or in subsequent decades to accept the formation of communal organizations in the countryside. This is particularly interesting because, in my opinion, this is at least an opinion that I've held consistently over time, I think this passed through the same development of the commune. Exactly because those peasants of the fringe areas of the district that were, as we just said, under the local aristocracy, tended to want to liberate themselves and to ideally also to urbanize themselves. It was said that if you went to the city and you stayed, 1 year and 1 day, you would be free from any kind of, this is just a saying, but it gives you a concrete idea of some customs that actually existed. Naturally, the city had a lot of interest for all these people to come live and work there. In any case, the district was operated by these peasants, so there couldn't be a city to begin with historically without the surplus of the countryside. So, as we explained in different videos, for example, in the series about Florence, especially the video about about the 12th century, in fact, from the death of Matilda of Canossa to the clashes. In fact, they immediately started of the commune there that had been sort of kept in standby by this sort of maternal figure almost. that was almost like a monarch, right? Keeping in check the rural nobility, because she was even way more powerful from her broader, can also regional scale holdings. And so the city was there being protected by her, that had a castle just next to it. And they did not call for the commune. They did not establish that until she died, and sort of the marquional power of Tuscany collapsed. And so they began to fight against those aristocrats that were left, that wanted to choke, to oppress the commune, not to make it spread, right? So if you think about this, it's obvious that the commune would provide with a model of liberty for these peasants of the countryside. Telling the truth, the commune itself had been born. Remember that it was always run by the consular regimes, the militas. Would itself control the countryside, would itself essentially project, because that was the institutional juridical mechanism, communal authority in lieu of the episcopal one, due to the bishops, counts mechanism started by the Ottonians, where essentially the bishop would receive also comital power to avoid split power to effect some counts that normally were rurally based, but still were to, at least in a transalpine mentality, because the Carolingians and the Ottonians had imported this mechanism of vassalic control of the city attentively, but in Italy could not work. And so they decided, okay, let's give the comital power to the bishops, because in any case they live in the they rule from the city, from the diocese, from the capitular center, and they are from there, just not to split the district like a lay count would do, right? Which had been in fact, the ruin of political integrity, of direct monarchical control in the Transalpine kingdoms. So it's obvious that the commune itself would eventually expand control over the peasant communes, but at the same time, there was always some kind of rural lineage of sort of feudal nobility around there that would try to contend the control over the district as a whole, that the commune would never 100% control, right? Even if they were very powerful, there always was also a subjection of the local rural nobility still enrocked in their castles, etc., even if some of them lived in the city in the same way. Because at the end of the day, why even going at war with them, right? It was all, as we explained, a precarious balance of power. I made lots of videos really about the Italian communes' relation with their district is incredibly important in and of itself. So you understand here also what was happening, especially, I drew this parallelism because of the timeline, 11th, 12th centuries. When you look at, the 13th and 14th century, you realize that towards the sort of the exhaustion, the collapse almost of Eurasian civilization, the peasantry was ever more pressed into communal armies, right? And they weren't even poorly equipped, because normally at that point the commune was a city-state and would provide, properly furnish arms and armor to the peasants themselves, but impose their military service, which was something that especially citizens who had money were paying not to go for anymore, because they could hire mercenaries, right? And the peasants would make the rank and file troop at that point, and that was an imposition. So there you actually find pretty developed rural communes that can't be successfully exploited by very powerful communes. And in all this, the countryside exhausts itself, the peasant communities themselves, and so there is a reseigneurialization of power with the mid-14th century. Also, the communes end up under the lords, that were already historically sort of urban by that point and autonomous, whatever, but in a sense had always maintained a connection with the countryside in a broader cultural and social sense as well. So it's a very fascinating mechanism. These rural communal bodies adopted institutional systems, notably consuls, elected representatives, just like the communes, unsurprisingly, and village assemblies that closely paralleled, again, one of the cities developing in the same period across northern and central Italy. It's impossible to unsee, again, the parallelism, as much as just the level of as we explained, societal development of political compaction was occurring under the communal regimes. The operations of these institutions increasingly fell under codified written regulations. From the late 12th century onward, for example, a growing number of rural collectivities obtained and maintained their own formal communal statutes, which formalized local governance, fiscal rules, and community rights. This happened just like, I don't know, we randomly know when the communes are founded because we find documents that state that there was a consul, right? There were consuls, right, issuing something. So if we were to see this, it's not like at the beginning, this is the moment to which for the first time, now these things had always kind of existed, right? There was also, again, time in the previous centuries in which most of these agreements were oral. There had always been that negotiation, there had always been that liberty and autonomy. This is completely normal, right? And now, if anything, things were being written down by peasants, for peasants. And this tells you, by the way, the level of literacy and general wealth that existed in the Italian kingdom at this point. Now, who can be held responsible for propelling this vigorous political movement forward, though? I mean, it could have not been just the average peasant. Yes, we understood, we said that there are people who are of a lower level, right? But these peasant communities are not detached in particular from the city. This is a prerogative of the Italian peninsula. Very high population density, concentrated in some specific areas, and therefore an incredible proximity of the city to practically any community, right? In France or in Germany, there were some forest communities that lived literally severed de facto from the rest of the world. Again, not quite literally, but still in a consistent sense. There were very different settlement patterns, very different sort of population density in some areas. In Italy, it was very different. And this meant that you couldn't really have these peasant communes without an actual level of socio-cultural development connected with the city, right? And so it's above all crucial to acknowledge that rural society underwent a slow but steady elevation in the status and influence of small-scale and middling landholders. And this makes lots of sense. Why? Because most of these people, or at least a consistent part of them, were historically the same communal citizens, right? Communal citizens lived in the city in their own quarters, but they tended also to inhabit the section of the city that outside the walls also owned the land outside of that. And so these were the same people sometimes that voted there. There were same sort of freemen that had a higher status, especially as citizens, as people who had the right, for example, and privilege for that matter, as duty to bear arms, and that owned serfs, for example, right? So there you would have also not just a lord, but some other actor that could simply tell these peasants how to organize themselves. This is naturally complex because, again, it's not like you simply go wherever you get out of the city and it's just you find your own people working there. Again, it's a very stratified reality where lots of communities live side by side. The peasants do really have a power. I think that I don't need to repeat this because we've seen it in many videos, but again, peasants had a much greater relative freedom in this period in history than they would have in the later Middle Ages, notoriously. Or also in the modern age, for that matter. In general, peasants in the Middle Ages were freer than they were in the modern era. This is notoriously the ABC of social history of the Ancien regime. And so, as a consequence, by the way, you would have some communal citizens that participated to this communal administration, or at least that were sort of delegating some sort of activities to them as well, which came together with the broader expansion of the period. The advancement resulted from, for example, the general economic expansion of the era marked by demographic growth, improved agricultural techniques, and expanding markets. that were, in any case, the city. That, again, all these peasants revolved around the city. There's no other way. They sold their products there. They lived thanks to especially at this point, like the protection of the same city. The cities fought against one another, so the communal army was also out there to defend the countryside as much as possible during raids. Consider this countryside just sticking to the Italian kingdom were dotted, were just hundreds of square kilometers, and they had hundreds of castles. All of it naturally were sort of smaller castles, the more stereotypical Disney was, but I mean they were all this incredibly thick net of defense, of mutual support, of interconnection. So even as a foreign army, so to say, you could plunder vast swathes of this territory, but many people would also escape successfully, would shut themselves down into local fortifications. You wouldn't have the time to besiege every single place. So that's also the reason why the commune could not control literally everything. There were still lords out there at a point in between communes that sort of played their own game as exiles. Sometimes, for example, as they were enemies of the commune, they would be supported by the rival communes to undermine territorial control. Because again, if you choke the countryside, you choke the city as well. But in this sense, you could also depend on the city, for example, for grain imports. They were not isolated systems. They didn't live only of what they grew locally. So much so that, in fact, the greater damage was mostly the one inflicted to specialized crops that historically had been heavily funded through, paradoxically, the same loot of the enemy countryside by the same militas, by the same consular class. That shows you how this entire mechanism, also like feudalism outside and there, the broader Western civilization was, of course, always pulled by the elite. Like the elite put everything in motion, just like they always do in every time in history, right? Without them, there is no establishment, there is no rationalization, there is no sort of capacity of managing power, warfare, control, authority, right? Power and so on. There were also at this point in history opportunities for initiative that seigneurial land management systems still afforded to enterprising cultivators. This should not be underestimated. In fact, this emerging group of small and medium proprietors often supplemented their farming with local commercial and artisanal activities. As we just pointed out, they depended on the broader mechanism. And there were also people who just wanted to say, okay, well, I will go over to that place because I know their land exploitation system, even the local ban on lordships, etc., are actually good. They seem to work. Consider that the lord could be anyone. Could be the traditional feudal rural one, could be a monastery, could be the city, could be a greater authority, and so on. These people were required to remit portions of their income to lords without receiving equivalent compensations, such as land grants or adequate protection. What has started as seigneurial safeguarding gradually transformed into onerous and relentless fiscal burdens as well, right? Concurrently, this ascending stratum within peasant communities did not restrict itself to the gradual incremental enlargement of holdings plot by plot. It also positioned itself to acquire jurisdictional authority and fiscal prerogatives achieved either through collective community efforts or on an individual basis. So in other words, the same affluent peasants or other, third estaters, and again, there were very different social types, especially in certain parts of Europe. It's been estimated that, in the Nievole Valley in Tuscany, 30% of families were basically involved in the notary business. Naturally, we're looking at probably the highest peak. This is the beginning of the 14th century of literacy, of per capita wealth, and so on. So it's the absolute, right? Society, it's still 30%. After all, other people leave with something else. But there were lots of crafts, lots of specializations. So especially when feudalism sort of loosens, there are still proper feudal lords out there, but they are sort of gradually tamed by the communes and or not holding sway, if not at some point even as city lords. And so at the head of a city-state over the countryside, they could simply leave room to these other mechanisms by switching to urbanization themselves. Again, that's how literally the communes were born. It's the rural aristocracy. It's a rural. They had already been urbanized by some degree, but historically, right, from Carolingian times, that aristocracy had been more rural. The Longobard one, for example, in the Italian kingdom, hadn't been rural largely. They already ruled from the city. They were literate. They exercised justice in quite literate fashion, so on. So very different from the Franks. So the system had mixed itself a little bit. The Franks imported much larger estates system, so fewer people in charge of sort of more. But this substratum of civic culture never came down. On the contrary, it helped fostering actual liberty. These were the freer places in Europe. If you really want to look at them, they're not some remote place with tribalism. It is literally the single most civilly advanced places, just like today in the world for that matter, that display more freedom and power for that matter, right? So this is an interesting lesson you can always draw from civilization and from these mechanisms that people always tend to overlook, misunderstand, twist, because they don't know what the hell they're talking about to begin with. So again, we've seen also lords that are more oppressive, right? They're definitely sort of more iron-fisted. They manage to impose to large parts of the population quite demanding conditions, but this also still corresponds to a need of these groups, of these people, to seek, right, that kind of protection, or they had simply been born there. They didn't see any greater opportunity in other places. In the moment, it would have been risky, and still it was all a legal binding of them, and for them it was in many ways just a big deal that they could be on the land, right? So there are all different reasons for how or why peasant communities would have different levels of personal freedom, right? But in general, right, that's how you can look at sort of step by step different regions of Europe, different relations of power, different wealth distribution, different mechanisms, etc. And I was looking at medieval society really made a lot by now, over 200. I didn't even remember how we had made so much. So it's a bit difficult. We should search for rural, perhaps, history, because there, we talked mostly about, what was this, countryside? Yeah, medieval countryside. Wow, 50 videos already. Really made a lot about this, and it's very interesting in any case. And we, from this era, we made lots of general videos also bigger. This is yet another interesting video that is very much connected with this. Medieval peasantry from serfdom to liberty, Liutprand, Otto III, and Nonanto, which really shows the entire arc from the 8th century, from the late Longobard period to basically the Ottonian era, and I think possibly also the Canossas are mentioned. In fact, I made another video very much connected. I'm glad we finally have this net very pertinent videos. This is very short. I don't know when oh wow, it's extremely short, as a matter of fact. I could have argumented a little bit more. That is, however, quite pertinent. Seigneurial control over human mobility. Mathilde of Canossa and the Kingdom of France compared in the 12th century. There you have also a bit of French history, and it shows there how, of course, it was a very different situation. I made different videos about, I don't know, Mann's regime and personal freedom, the corvée, corvaria, the free work performances and cost-benefit ratio in the seigneurial system. There is the one about the Longobard nobility and the passage from Coloni to Massari that shows you also that this came from the top, as we've seen today. The lords actually largely carried out this mechanism. If you're interested in, I don't know, there are some things, Carolingian peasant families, if you really want. there, the video that I told you about the concerning medieval English peasant autonomy from the 12th to the 13th century in a European comparative perspective. The other one I told you, the simulation of servile and free Massarian devolution of the concept of service, that is in that mostly in Transalpine fashion, how things evolved over time. We talked about here, what else? Check the images too, because some of these I actually didn't allow because I had to re-upload them. But here, for example, there's this video, landed and banal lordship, the differences and analogies, right? There's a difference between being a landowner and being a lord simply that owns places, and having probably a banal lordship in the broader, still de facto public system of at least recognition of power. Another video was the development of banal lordship as well. This is very early videos in 2019 even. Well, the seigneurial initiative in the reorganization of high medieval Europe, of course, we know the origins of sharecropping in 13th, 14th century Italian communes. That's interesting. It shows you how specialized these crops and land exploitations had become by that point. This one, okay, it's too early, depending on a banal lordship. It's a very early video of mine of August 2018. Cives and Omnes in the communal world. Well, this is an interesting video that I made the same May 2018. It's very early videos, as a matter of fact. And there is always actually a lot of, this is from the countryside and agriculture, but there are many others that I made from the sort of general societal mechanisms, seigneurial. For example, there is that series about seigneurial system. Yeah. And here there's a lot, really a lot. Domini milites and rustici, the landed seigneury and the feudal system, Western France, okay. The dominatus loci, and the difference again between landed and banal lordship, another video I made on that topic, interestingly enough. So yeah, these are some videos that people kind of never watch because, as I said at the beginning, they don't even know what technically is that I'm discussing. But in general, I think it's useful to discuss it because the more people talk about it, obviously, the better it is. And in general, spreading some kind of awareness on these topics and being capable of reconstructing a bit what medieval Europe actually was in the societal terms is worth it. It's a way to tell history that you don't find much around, and then instead is incredibly important and should be really made way more frequently and with much greater control and connection. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.